Hello, everybody. I hope you are having a lovely day. As they say, hip hip hooray. Now, for those who've seen the thumbnail, this video is actually going to be talking about my personal top 10 favorite cards from the multiplanar Death Race set, Aetherdrift. Now, this set actually looks pretty legit. Like, I know for some people it's a very silly set. I understand that. There's definitely a lot of silly shenanigans in this set. But this set also is a very powerful set. There's actually a lot of really good cards in this set. Like, I was tempted to make a top 20, but we're going to stick to the top 10. There's even some cards that didn't make the list, like Marauding Mako, which I love that shark. That shark is great, but it was cut off the list. So, yeah. But still, nevertheless, that's what honorary mentions are for. Speaking of which, let's actually get to the honorary mentions. First of all, I gotta talk about the completion of the Verge cycle. Great to have this completion of this land cycle. Great for standard. It's good to have land fitsing for multicolored deck designs. Great land cycle. We've seen the power of it within the Dustmourne, essentially introducing the cycle, and now the completion of it in Aetherdrift. Perfect sauce. Multicolored decks are grateful. I also have to talk about Momentum Breaker as well as Grim Bobble, because mostly these are just going to be perfect additions to the Self-Bounce, Esper Pitsy, as well as Demir Pitsy deck designs that pretty much are going to constantly bounce these and make us constantly have to lose our creature through the -2/-2, as well as constantly edict or discard. Yay? Yeah, it's still one of the top decks in the format, and they are going to appreciate the new tools. And the other card I have to put on the honorary mention, even though it's a little bit controversial... I'm sorry, I gotta put Radiant Lotus on here. Yes, I know this card, I kind of lost my mind when I actually initially saw the card.
What the revealed by Weekly MTG.
I will admit, I kind of went a little crazy on this card. But the more I think about it, first of all, it's still going to be a perfect card for my Gimbal deck, my pet commander deck Gimbal. And pretty much going to be perfect for any deck that makes multiple artifact tokens in general. Like, specifically like Breya, as well as like Sophia and such. But still, besides that, the card itself is just... It's good, but it's kind of just fine. Like, you really want to be in a deck that just has a heavy amount of artifacts before playing this. Yes, the power of this can't be underestimated. Being able to make all your artifacts into a temporary one-time activation of a Black Lotus can give you an explosion of mana that should not be underestimated. I think a lot of people are forgetting in Standard how many good X spells we have in Standard and coming into Standard. So you got to keep that in the back of your brain, as well as just some good artifact decks. But this one is going to be kind of we have to wait and see. 6 mana is still a lot. But I like the card personally. I had fun with it during the streamer event in a Boros kind of like artifact control deck personally. But this one definitely has a chance, so you want to keep your eye on it. Nevertheless, let's get started with the list now, shall we?
Number 10.
Number 10 on this list, and it's pretty easy inclusion on the list. We gotta talk about Debris Beetle. Now, for those who don't know, this is essentially a vehicle iteration of a very popular card from the Con Standard, which is Siege Rhino. We literally got a Siege Rhino as a vehicle, which, that's pretty good. Now, it's hard because I think a lot of people are going to put him on their top 10 list, mostly just because a lot of people underestimated Siege Rhino when it was originally introduced in cons, and, well, Siege Rhino is, as we learned from that standard, was a very powerful standard-defining card in general. It's going to be kind of interesting to see if a vehicle version of this card can actually make it into standard, but I think it's going to, mostly because it's in Gagari, and Gagari does have ways to constantly crew the sits with trample with stuff like Mosswood Dread Knight, essentially. That stick creature that can constantly crew this. And just, as we learned with Siege Rhino, being able to essentially get the Lightning Helix effect as an ETB trigger is very good, especially if you have ways to flicker or copy the card. Which we do have ways to copy artifacts in Standard in general, so yeah, keep an eye on Siege Rhino as a vehicle. I am not totally hyped on the card, because I'm still kind of cautious if Siege Rhino, at least this take on Siege Rhino, will be powerful enough within the current Standard. but I am going to say it will have a chance at the very least. So number 10 on my list, Debris Beetle. Also, yes, it is really cute that they made what essentially in the alternate art is a Siege Rhino as the debris vehicle, being a hint at Siege Rhino. It's a cute little nod. I'm going to give them that. Number 9 on this list, we gotta talk about what of course has to be in a racing set, which is the Speed Demon. Now this introduced the Start Your Engine mechanic for this list, so just a quick point of what that is. Start Your Engine is a effect that permanents can have that essentially allows you to gain speed. When you control your first permanent, you get speed 1, and then during your turn, anytime the first instance an opponent has lose life, you are going to gain a speed. It triggers only once each turn. Now, this card is just ridiculously absurd as a 5-drop demon. Just being able to, at your instep, draw X cards equal to your speed level is kind of absurd. Now, this could be a bit of a risky mechanic with the factor that you're going to have life loss, but let's be honest, as long as Shieldred's still in Standard, that's not going to be too much of a problem. As well as we have Unholy A-Nets, as well as other ways to gain life to help essentially mitigate the life loss that we're going to get from this. But overall, it's just a really good card draw engine of a card that's also on a 5/5 trample. Very aggressively mid-game threat that gives you card advantage. It's pretty good, in my opinion. Number 8 on this list, this one, since one of the planes we're visiting due to this Death Ray set is Amoket, we gotta talk about the Amoket gods. But let's start with Hazaret, the Godseeker. I think it's just a really good, kind of like mid-range aggro card. Being able to make your little creatures be able unblockable, it's nice to help activate the max speed mechanic. And if you do get max speed, just having a 5/3 with Indestructible is a pretty good threat in general. You do have to keep in mind early game exile removal, but still it's something to keep in mind. It is definitely the kind of the worst of the bunch, but it's still a pretty good card. Then there's also Ketramos, the New Dawn. This is just going to be probably a new favorite commander for a lot of players. Just 3 mana 4/4, mana likely indestructible, but also essentially anytime, the first time you exile a card, or not even the first time, actually anytime you exile a card either from your graveyard or from the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose a life. This synergizes with a lot of things like Graveyard Hate, any type of exile spells like Sword of Plowshares, or any standard equivalent get a lot better with Ketramos on the battlefield, casting Sorcery Speed to net the card draw. But this also works with flicker effects, so if you flicker cards, you essentially be able to get the card draw as well. Ketramos is just a ridiculously powerful god, and if you do get to the 7 cards exiled, depending on who, no matter that requirement to make it into a creature, just a menace likely indestructible is just nuts. But also the last god, and I still think personally my favorite and the best of the bunch, we gotta talk about Sabsunin, Lutza Embodied. Yeah, it's a big frog god, but also just a really good card in general, just a sits where for each trample indestructible. Very powerful. Essentially the factor that you can attack when you have an even number of counters. Keep in mind, 0 is an even number, so this can block the soon you cast it. And then every incremental turn, when it gets an odd number of counters, you draw 2 cards. That's a ridiculously good card advantage engine. Also, keep in mind, there are ways in Simic to manipulate counters, so you can have it where a turn where, like, let's say, for example, Innkeeper's Talent, where you essentially will get the card draw from the odd number of counters, go to combat, put a count on Sabsunin, it's an even number now, so now you can attack with, say, for example, an 8/8 or 10/10 Sabsunin with Reach, Trample, and Indestructible. Probably one of the more powerful gods for a standard, in my personal opinion. If a Simic midrange deck plays this card, I would not be surprised. It's very powerful. So yeah, number 8 on the list, it's gotta be the Amoket gods without a sweat. Number 7 on this list, this one we're going to also have a little tie again, but I feel like we just have to talk about both of these cards in general. The Planeswalkers in this set are actually pretty strong, even though they're a little bit niche. So let's first talk about Shanra, Spark Hunter. Now this one, if a vehicle deck exists in your respective format and you can play Shanra, I do think it's a worthy card to test out. Being able to have the ability to automatically have a vehicle automatically crewed and attack with haste, very powerful static effect for Shanra. But even then, just the general effects you get from her, it's actually not bad. Being able to rummage or sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. There's a lot of ways you make artifact tokens in general, so it's pretty easy to get your card draw advantage with that plus. There is also just being able to make a vehicle token in general, which then works with the static effect, which is pretty nice. So if you just need another aggressive creature to attack in, that's nice. And of course, the ultimate is absolutely absurd, being able to essentially, anytime you make an artifact or have an artifact put on the battlefield under your control, you bolt something. Very powerful ultimate, and not that hard to get to. The only catch with this card is, I will admit, it doesn't really have a way to protect itself with, like, making creatures and such, and generally good planeswalkers are ones that are able to protect themselves. But I said it's a card I want to keep an eye on. Ironically enough, it's actually going to probably go into my Gimbal deck without much of a sweat, since it makes a unique artifact token. But still, we also have to talk about the prize, the race, the Aetherdrift. I have to admit, the Aetherdrift is a little bit peculiar. It has the weakness where, since it's an artifact planeswalker, that does mean that it gets hit by artifact hate pretty well. Like, you're going to probably see this tear asunder a couple times. However, I do think this is a card that's actually just a good, as I would call it, a one splash up, because it's a colorless artifact that can go into any deck design. Specifically, you want to put this in creature-oriented deck designs, and overall, it's pretty good what you get. You buff up one of your creatures, and the factor that it gets counters due to combat damage from your creature, and no, it doesn't have to be combat damage to players, it can be any source of damage that your creature does, which is pretty good. Any realm of combat damage, to clarify. So, yeah, that can get a lot of counters on it really quick, and to me, I think the basic is, if you can at least buff one of your creatures, and then do the minus to draw 2 cards, you get all you need out of the card. If it gets removed after you do that, you'll feel fine, because you got yourself a divination and buff one of your creatures. We play like Glimmer of Geniuses, for Pete's sake, so if you get that, I think you get the bases, but I would not be surprised if this card actually draws 2, 3, or essentially 2, 4, or 6 more cards than you would think it would, honestly. And of course, if we get to the ultimate, that's a burst of mana. Never underestimate a burst of mana, especially as stated before, we have a lot of good spells and standards, so don't sleep on that. It also allows you to play more creatures on the battlefield, which, heck, is really good with the fact with the Aetherdrift. So yeah, I really like both planeswalkers, even though I do think it's going to take a minute to find the proper home for them. But I think for the Aetherdrift, it's just generally a good splash card in any creature mid-range deck. In genre, if the vehicle or a artifact-centric deck design is powerful enough that can run her, I think they will run her without much of a sweat. So, number 7 on the list, we gotta talk about both planeswalkers in the set, both genre as well as the Aetherdrift. Number 6 on this list, this one's kind of quick and to the point, it's the Waxen Shapefy. This is essentially a Phyrexian Metamorph that has Flash and Cycling. That's really good. Being able to have cycling, so you can actually cycle it early and then reanimate it later, is going to be very relevant, especially with a card that's going to be upcoming on the list. Wink, wink, nod, nod. But also just the factor that it is flash speed means you can do this at the end of the opponent's step, and there are some things, or even during combat, which can make some interesting circumstances. Like, let's say, for example, your opponent builds a board, and then oh, you wax and shape chief and make a second copy of your, say, Portal to Phyrexia? Or maybe even you're attacking in with, like, you have a Simulacrum Synthesizer on the battlefield, you attack in with, like, let's say, for example, a 5/5 Construct. They block with a 5/5, but then you flash in and make a second copy of the Simulacrum Synthesizer to give your constructs +2/+2 from both the second Simulacrum Synthesizer as well as the token's going to make. Like, there's a lot of neat interactions you can do with this Flash clone, so very powerful card. I can see it seeing some play in some decks, because a Flash speed clone that you can just cycle if you don't need the clone, very good. Number 5 on this list, and I feel like we just have to put a whole cycle on this number 5, because all these are very powerful cards, and we gotta talk about the Gearhulk cycle. So in Aetherdrift, since we went to Avishkar, aka previously known as Kaladesh, we actually have a return of the Gearhulk cycle, and this time we actually have ally-colored Gearhulks, and they are ridiculously absurdly powerful cards. Like, we have the Pyrewood Gearhulk, which just essentially is a Craterhoof-like effect, which a Craterhoof-like perhaps without haste is kind of but the factor that it gives the buff as well as Menace and Vigilance is nothing to sleep on. Also, damage can't be prevented this turn. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised how effective that can be against some deck designs, so don't sleep on the Gearhulk of the Pyrewood variety. We also have the Oil Deep Gearhulk, ridiculously absurd Dimir Gearhulk, that just being able to, you can either rummage or Fox Seize your opponent with the ETB, And just being a 4/4 with lifelink in Ward 1. Really nice in Dimir to have a little bit of return of life gain. I can see some Dimir decks playing this without much of a sweat. We also have the Riptide Gear Hulk, just ridiculously absurd. Just double strike powerless, and then just being able to return an opponent's permanent third from the bottom of the library. If you're playing like an Azorius Mill deck, I think you're just going to play this card just because for the cheeky interaction to be able to play this and then essentially bounce your opponent's worst threat into the library and then use, like, say, for Etsy and Jace to mill the cards, which, yeah, get prepared for that annoying interaction, y'all. But we also have to talk about the Selesnya Gear Hulk, which I still think is, like, the best one of the bunch, personally. Just being able to be a 4/4 first strike trample and then just toolbots, tutor your best mana value 1 creature, enchantments, and such. Very good. Just being able to tutor for any 2 creatures or artifacts or enchantments of mana value 1. We have seen like a range of EOS effects before, and that proven to be powerful effects. Just the fact that this can tutor for a lot of stuff within the mana value 1, which is very powerful, like Ghost Vacuum, stuff like that. It's going to be a very good, like, Selesnya aggro toolbox card in general. But also, I do want to talk also about the Rakdos Gear Hulk, which some people have been saying is debatably the worst, but I don't think it is. I think this is actually ridiculously powerful. Just being a 5/4 minutes Death Touch, but then when it enters, you can reanimate from any graveyard a creature with mana value 4 or less, and it can attack in with haste and menace and Death Touch. Ridiculously absurd, especially with saying, like, I don't know, if you cycle a specific clone of the Wax variety early in the game to say, I don't know, reanimate it and then copy this Gear Hulk, which then will reanimate maybe another Watson Shapeshifter that you had cycled in the graveyard, or any other clones you put in the graveyard. You kind of see where this is going. So this can also be kind of like a victory condition in the right circumstances. If you're like a Gritz's Mill deck where you mill a bunch of clones, you play Cold Stove Gear Hulk, make a bunch of hasty, Menace Death Touchy copies of himself, and then just swing in for the finish. So, nevertheless, number 5 on the list, it's all the Gear Hulks. They're very powerful, and I would be very surprised if at least all of them have at least see play in one deck or the other without much of a sweat. Number 4, and also what's going to be number 3 on this list, is going to be actually some really good goblins. And I'm going to be honest with you, this set provided a lot of really good goblins, so it was kind of hard to stick down to 2. I was even thinking about cheating, but I figured we would not cheat this time around. But for number 4 on the list, the goblin I wanted to feature is the House Squad Heavy. This is just a ridiculously absurd goblin. Just being able... A Goblin Rabblemaster has always been proven to be very good cards in general. But the fact is, this is the Goblin Rabblemaster that also give your goblins haste, which is very relevant, especially since we have Krinko from Foundations. Turn 3 this, turn 4 Krinko, you see where we're going, we're going to make a bunch of goblins. But even then, if you can get to the max speed, which I'm going to be honest with you, getting to the max speed in goblins is not going to be that hard. Giving goblins a Priest of Titania effect is absolutely absurd. There is a lot of ways that they could spend a lot of mana, especially in this format. Like I said, a lot of good spells. So yeah, giving goblins a Priest of Titanium effect is pretty absurd. So yeah, number 4 on this list, it has to be the House Squad Heavy. And there is still a part of me that is laughing my head off that number 4, at least if we look at the showcase variant of this art, that literally our first Goblin Priest of Titania is literally a Goblin Party Man, which... That's funny, y'all. I'm not gonna lie. That's absolutely hilarious. Number 3 on this list is a pretty easy one to include because this card is potentially the most powerful card of the set, depending on who you ask. And that has to be Monument to Endurance. Now, this card doesn't look like much because it's like, oh, it's technically 3 mana, do nothing when you play it unless you discard a card. What's powerful about that? The reason why this card is absurd is because there's a lot of cards that we will play in multiple formats in general that just discard cards at the cost, but thanks to Monument Endurance, they now become a benefit. Like, say, for example, oh, you're Psychic Frog, you discard a card to get the counter on it. Well, now your discard can draw you another card, or get you a treasure, or drain your opponent. And there are instant speed ways to essentially be able to discard, which means in general... You can activate this ability even though you activate one of each ability during a turn. You can activate this potentially during your opponent's turns as well, which getting all that incremental value from your discard is ridiculously absurd. I mean, there's even contemplation of playing this in Modern, mostly because of potentially stuff like Burning Inquiry and stuff like in the Hollow One decks in general. But even in Standard, there's just a lot of good applications. Like, one of the more better board wipes in Izzet is the Ill-Timed Explosion. So being able to just draw and then discard 2 cards that you really didn't want to discard in general, but you need to for the board wipe, well, now you get the benefit of a treasure or card draw, or just the incremental to just drain your opponent. Not drain, but, deal free damage to your opponent. And even then, there's stuff like Artist Talent, which now anytime you cast an instant or pretty much any non-creature spells, you loot, which is kind of absurd, really, if I'm being honest. Like, there's a lot of stuff that essentially, once you kind of realize it, it becomes a ridiculously absurd engine card. So, yeah, don't sleep on Monument to Endurance. Potentially one of the better cards of the set. Don't be surprised if you see this a lot in multiple formats. Number 2 on this list, and it's still personally one of my close to personal favorite cards of the set. And we gotta talk about the new Duretti. The new Duretti is absolutely hilarious. It's a really great card. Getting pretty much a Trash for Treasure on a ETB as well as an attack trigger is absolutely absurd. That's a ridiculously absurd ability to put on a creature, especially one where you have like an Artificer, so you can do like Roaming Throne, name Artificer, and repeat that ability twice, or even like any general way of Panharmonicon effects in general. But even then, just this ability is ridiculously absurd, especially when you consider that there's a lot of easy ways to throw really high powerful artifacts into the graveyard, and essentially be able to make artifact tokens like treasure, blood tokens, clue tokens, etc., and just using Duretti's effect to just sacrifice one of those tokens to return like a Portal to Phyretzia or any high powerful artifact. Absolutely absurd. I even seen some loops where essentially people play like, say, Saheeli's Latest as well as Brass's Bounty to essentially have an engine where if you play the Duretti, you sacrifice Saheeli's Latest. If Brass's like, not Brass's Bounty, Brass's Drill. Brass Drill, I think. It's something like that. So Brass Drill, essentially, and then you return the Drill from the graveyard to the battlefield to discard cards you want to, maybe more powerful artifacts, to then just draw more cards. And then you can sacrifice the Brass's Drill to then return Saheeli's Latest. Like, you kind of see where this is going. There's a lot of powerful engines. Like, anyone who ever played, like, with the previous iteration of Duretti as a Planeswalker, you kind of know the drill with this card. Wow, the fact that we talked about Brass's Drill is kind of funny, but you get my point. Personally, number 2 on this list, it has to be Duretti, because Duretti is a very powerful commander, as well as I think it has a chance in Standard for some potential silly shenanigans, in my personal opinion.
Number 1.
And number 1, my number 1 card of the set, and this one, I think people kind of saw it being foreshadowed, but yeah, I know, whether you love him or hate him, we gotta talk about this card, and that is Loot the Pathfinder. Oh, this card's absurd. Okay, Loot the Pathfinder is a 5-mana Temur legendary that's a 2/4 with Double Strike, Haste, and Vigilance, because why not? And also now, it also is another card that shows off the exhaust mechanic, and it gives you the exhaust mechanic of giving you access to some of the more powerful spells in Magic. Access to any Colic Dark Ritual, or an Ancestral Recall, or to a Lightning Bolt on a creature. That is ridiculously absurd. And the thing that many people have pointed out, including myself, this is actually, it is kind of weird because I kind of foreshadowed this unintentionally when I was talking about my top 10 cards of Foundation. I was like, with the Foundations loot, it's like, well, maybe you want to throw Foundations loot into the Cauldron to get that activated ability, even though it was a little bit mana intensive. However, Aqua Assault Cauldron and the new loot from Aetherdrift, the Pathfinder, is absurd together. Because loot with all those activated abilities, it's cute, and it's very powerful. Giving all of your creatures with counters on them, if loot's in the Aqua Assault Cauldron, those abilities is absolutely absurd. Like, I've seen during the streamer event for contests, I've seen people even playing this in Roots decks in general that plays Aqua Assault Cauldron, just by the fact that because giving all your plant tokens with counters on them, that they are going to get counters on them in general, thanks to how Roots work, giving them access to Loot's abilities is absolutely almost to the borderline busted. Like, yeah, and even then, even if you don't go into the Agava Soul Cauldron route, which honestly I think you still have to go the Agava Soul Cauldron route, even if you don't throw loot into the Cauldron, because just being able to have your activated abilities, be able to use any mana to activate any of those abilities, very powerful in general, the first line of Agava Soul Cauldron Tets. But still, nevertheless, Luden himself is just a really fun commander card in general. Like, I've even heard people building CEDH decks around him. Because even if you don't do the Agava Soul Cauldron trick, there's just ways to activate this ability multiple times if you use, like, blinking effects, essentially, or flicker effects in general. Just very powerful card. And even then, it's still a 5-mana 2/4 with Double Strike. You can literally attack with him, have 1 red mana up, your opponent tries to block with, like, say, they're 5/5 and they think they'll be fine. Nope, you activate Loot's exhaust ability to deal the lightning bolt to that creature, and then its first strike damage is going to kill the creature before Loot is dead. It just... this card. I mean, I'm happy that Loot got a really, really good card, even though I know a lot of people don't like Loot. Trust me, I'm going to have a video talking about that soon, so stay tuned for that. But still, my number 1 card in the set is Loot the Pathfinder. This card is ridiculously absurd. Very powerful. There's a lot of silly shenanigans this card is going to do during its lifetime in Standard as well as just Commander in general. And that is my top 10 cards from the Magic the Gathering set, Aetherdrift. So, what were your personal favorites on this death race of shenanigans? List them down below, and I hope you all have a lovely day. As they say, hip hip hooray.